Hey, welcome. If you were with me last week, you know I'm doing a series based on a book called Messy Spirituality by Michael Yaconelli. I'm calling this How to Love Jesus When Your Life is a Hot Mess. I'm impatient, a bad temper, I drink too much, I cuss a little, I really don't pray or read the Bible a lot, whatever. The point is, being spiritual and being perfect are not necessarily the same thing. In fact, at times they can be polar opposite. But here's the good news. Jesus came preaching this preposterous notion that plain old broken down, messed up people like some of us could still be part of God's family. Like the blind man in John chapter 9 that Jesus healed. You'll remember this story. Listen to this. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so the works of God might be displayed in him. And then verse 6. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. Now, at first glance, this is a fascinating story about a literal miracle. But it's also the story of resistance. Because often the miracles and life change Jesus brought to the spiritual scene did not set well with the religious leaders. What he preached and proclaimed was really antithetical to most everything they believed and taught. Jesus came turning their religious world virtually upside down. Therefore, Jesus and his followers, and even those who he healed and blessed, we're experiencing some great resistance and vitriol from the established religious crowd. But how many of you know, when Jesus is for you, nothing or no one can be against you? So I have three things for you today from this teaching I'm calling Jesus is always for you. And the first one is this. Because Jesus is for you, he does not want you to get too comfortable with your Christianity. In the next few verses, you can read how twice these Pharisees summoned this man who was healed, trying to get him to denounce Jesus as a false prophet. They didn't like it that Jesus was stirring up the people, causing them to believe that he was a prophet sent from God. I mean, they had their religious system. They had it all worked out and kept everyone under their control for hundreds of years. But along comes Jesus, setting people free and making a mess of things. And they were very uncomfortable with that. You see, religion doesn't always like messy people so much. Because messy people tend to be open about their messiness, about their spiritual walk, their victories and their defeats, their faith and their fears, their highs and their lows, their ups and their downs. People who aren't messy, actually, by the way, everyone is messy. Some just pretend that they're not, so they never have to admit it. But church people who are not admitting to their messiness, they hate it when someone comes along and allows others to see their brokenness or unfixedness. So what we have to be careful about is that we don't give in to religious pressure to conform to a certain way of living out the life of Christ within us. The saddest Christians I know are those like the disciples in the boat when the storm came up and they thought they saw a ghost on the water and it was Jesus. Let me come to you on the water, Peter said. And he did, by the way. But don't you imagine those people in the boat, the other disciples, don't you think they kind of envied Peter? Wished they could have got out of the boat too? You see, it's real easy to just get comfortable, to take our Christian experience for granted, to ride along in the boat. But here's the deal. If you're a follower of God, he won't let you stay comfortable. He will constantly be challenging you and inspiring you and moving you forward, surprising you. And you know why? It's his nature. He is the master of surprises. Think about it. God speaks and creates a universe, complete with donkeys that talk, pillars of salt, a young boy who slays a giant, a sea that splits in two, and a Messiah that heals with mud packs and spit. So because Jesus is for you, he doesn't want you to get too comfortable. Secondly, he does not want you to be deceived. Have you ever had someone say something about you that was just patently false? Or they called you names or put you down or said things just to hurt you? Has that ever happened to you? Watch this in verse 17. Then they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes that were opened. And the man replied, he's a prophet. They still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. Is this your son? They asked. Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it now that he can see? Now get that. They were basically calling the blind man and his parents liars when they clearly were not. Then in verse 28 it says they hurled insults at him. And in verse 34 it says you have been a sinner from the day you were born. Insults, lies, put down. Most of us know how that feels because we've all experienced it. You'll never amount to anything. You can't do anything right. You're so stupid. You're ugly. You make me sick. You'll never change. All these boxes people try to put us in and that we in turn put them in. Michael Yaconelli tells a story of a woman named Margaret who'd lived a long time with the memory of one day in a schoolhouse that she attended many, many years before. From the first day of class, Margaret and her harsh and bitter teacher, Mrs. Garner, didn't get along. Over the next couple of years, the animosity grew between them until that one fateful day when she was 9 years of age, Margaret's life changed forever. That day, Margaret raced in from recess late again, and the teacher lost it. Margaret, we've been waiting for you. You're late again. Get up here to the front of the class right now. And Margaret walked slowly up to the teacher. She was told to face the class, and then the nightmare began. Boys and girls, Margaret's been a bad girl. I've tried to help her be responsible, but apparently she doesn't want to learn. So we're going to teach her a lesson. She instructed each child to come to the chalkboard and write down something bad about Margaret, telling them that maybe the experience would motivate Margaret to be a better person. Margaret stood frozen, as you can imagine, next to the teacher as one by one the children came to the chalkboard, each one writing life-smothering words that slowly but surely extinguished the light in Margaret's soul. Margaret is stupid. Margaret is bad. Margaret is a dummy. Margaret is ugly. Margaret is selfish. On and on it went until 25 scribblings of Margaret's badness screamed out from that board to her little 9-year-old heart. That afternoon, Margaret walked home alone on what felt like was the longest day of her life. When she got home, she went right to bed claiming she felt ill, and she tried to cry her pain away, but to no avail. Now here she is, 40 years later, slumped in a psychologist's waiting room, still cringing in the shadow of those 25 sentences. Because to her horror, Margaret had slowly over the years become exactly what those students had written. Isn't that just so sad? So here's the issue for us. How do we respond? What do we do when we too are abused like that? Do we give in? Okay, I guess I'm just going to be a loser. Do we give up? What's the use? I'll never be worthy. Or do we refuse to be deceived by what we experience and by faith trust the God in us to heal us, to love us, and to remind us that through Him we can do all things? So Jesus won't let us get too comfortable. He won't let us be deceived. And last, He does want us to trust in Him. Again, verse 34 and verse 35, this is great. They replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw Him out. Jesus heard that they had thrown Him out and said, and found Him and said to Him, "Do you believe in me, in the Son of Man?" Now watch this. The religious leaders here condemned this man and threw him out. But Jesus did the opposite. He went back out, searched for this man, refusing to abandon him the way everyone else had. And then when He found the man, Jesus revealed Himself as the Savior. And the man believed on Him on the spot. Notice there's no condemnation in these verses of the man's bad theology or his failure to give the right answers when he was questioned. There is just love and concern and acceptance. Isn't that great? By the way, remember Margaret? After decades of depression and anxiety, she finally sought help. And she was having that last session with her psychologist. 2 long years of weekly counseling helped Margaret finally extricate herself from her past. It had been a long and difficult road, but she smiled at her counselor as they talked about her readiness to move on to the next chapter. Well, Margaret, the counselor began, I guess it's graduation day. How are you feeling? Margaret responded, I guess I'm okay. The counselor hesitated. Margaret, I know this will be difficult, but just to make sure you're ready, I want to ask you to do something. I want you to think back on your classroom and detail the events of that day one last time. I want you to describe each of the children as they approach the chalkboard. And then I want you to remember what each one of them wrote down about you on that day. Now, in one sense, this would be an easy task for Margaret, because even though it had been 40 years, she still remembered every detail. But on the other hand, to go through that nightmare again would mean summoning every ounce of strength and courage that she had. So after a long silence, she began. One by one, she recalled each child. She remembered every detail, every hurtful word, often having to stop to compose herself, yet she continued confronting every single one of them. Finally, she was done, and the tears would just not stop. Margaret cried for a long, long time before she realized someone was whispering her name. Margaret, Margaret, Margaret. She looked up to see her counselor staring into her eyes, saying her name over and over again. She finally stopped crying for a moment, and her counselor said, Margaret, you left out one person. Well, I certainly did not, she replied. I've lived with this story for 40 years. I know every student by heart. No, Margaret, you did forget someone. Do you see him? He's sitting in the back of the classroom. Now he's getting up and walking over to the chalkboard, and he's picking up the eraser. Can you see him? Now he's erasing every one of those sentences the students wrote. Every one. They are gone, Margaret. They are gone. Now he's turning to look at you. Do you recognize him? It's Jesus. And look, he's writing new sentences on the board. Margaret is loved. Margaret is beautiful. Margaret is gentle. Margaret is strong. Margaret has great courage. And of course, Margaret began to weep. However, very quickly the weeping turned into a smile, and then into laughter, and then into more tears. Tears of joy this time. After 40 dark and depressive years, Margaret was no longer alone and no longer rejected. I love a story with a happy ending, don't you? So listen, here's the takeaway today. Jesus is always for us. Always. And if Jesus is for us, who can be against us? The answer, of course, is no one and no thing. Which means you don't have to worry and fret that you love Jesus, but your life gets messy sometimes. Look at someone right now and say, Jesus is always for me. Okay, that's it for today. If I can help you or pray for you, please let me know. Contact me at newdaychurchbrandon.org with a message, or just go on social media and send me a personal message. So thank you for joining me today. I look forward to seeing you again next time. God bless. Have a great week.